It's my great honor to introduce to you MK Yair Lapid. He's the founder and chairperson of Yesh, Atid. He served as Israel's finance minister and as a member of the political security cabinet. Before his entry into politics, former Minister Lapid was a leading television personality and highly influential columnist. Former Minister Lapid is also a prolific writer, having published 11 books, a number of which became bestsellers in Israel. He is a two-time recipient of the Platinum Book Award by the Israeli Union of Publishers. Please welcome former Minister Yair Lapid.
Good morning. The subject I want to discuss here today is the fact that the United Nations has lost it. When it comes to Israel, the UN has lost credibility, lost common sense, and more than anything, lost its most important asset, its integrity. At the end, thank you. At the end of last March, I stood in Geneva with hundreds of protesters wrapped in Israeli flags. We stood beneath the broken chair monument which stands opposite the United Nations Human Rights Council. Inside, in the elegant hall, there was a debate, another debate about Israel. The United Nations Human Rights Council treatment of Israel has strayed from the boundaries of legitimate criticism long ago. It has become a disturbing obsession. In the past decade, the Council has voted for 61 resolutions condemning human rights abuses across the world and 67 resolutions which condemned Israel. Let me repeat this for you. The Council has condemned Israel, a democratic country which upholds international law, more times than the rest of the world combined. In this past decade, over 400,000 people have been massacred in Syria. There was the war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the Ukraine. China and Iran carry out capital punishments on a daily basis. But Israel is the only country on earth which warrants its own agenda item in the United Nations Human Rights Council, Agenda Item 7. Agenda Item 7 dictates that every time the Council meets for session, there will be a discussion of the human rights situation in Israel. The discussion happens irrespective of whether or not there have been reports of human rights violations. It happens without a factual examination of the complaints lodged by Palestinians, usually allies or members of the various terror organizations that are sworn to destroy Israel. Objective analysis of the complaints by external organizations and governments has proven time after time that the complaints are fabricated by the dubious DBS organizations. For the United Nations, this just doesn't matter. In my speech to the demonstrators, I pointed out that the Council has never dealt with the fact that Israel faces 4 Islamist terror organizations at the same time: Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. These are organizations which openly state they want to murder Jews just because they are Jews. And they're not alone. They receive financial and logistical backing, arms, and aid from Iran. Iran, the only United Nations member which publicly states its goal is the total destruction of another UN member, Israel. It goes without saying that the UN has never demanded that it recount these statements. Together with me under the broken chair stood some of the victims. An impressive young man whose father, an Israeli peace activist, was murdered by a suicide bomber on a Jerusalem bus. A woman who went for a hike with a friend and their Labrador dog and was attacked by Palestinian terrorists. They stabbed her friend to death, stabbed her dozens of times, and stabbed the dog as well. I don't know why, she said to me quietly, but most people are more shocked that they killed the dog than my friend. After the demonstration, they went to speak before the council. They received a cold and rude reception. While they bore witness to the loss of their loved ones, the delegates ate, intentionally spoke loudly, and walked in and out. No one said a word about Israel defending women's rights and gay rights. No one said a word about Israel Arab citizens sitting in its parliament and on its Supreme Court and all in its public institutions. In short, no one said a word about Israel being a thriving democracy, embodying as its way of life anything the United Nations exists to promote. Israel enemies, on the other hand, hang gay people from telephone poles, believe women are the property of their husband, and obviously do not believe in institutions like the United Nations. The Wall Street Journal and the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy showed in a research that it is Hamas which stands behind most of the lies against Israel, which the UN so willingly buys. Clause 13 of the Hamas Charter states the following: there is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. Initiatives, proposals, and international conferences are all a waste of time and vain endeavors. A few months after the embarrassing meeting in Geneva, the World Health Organization, another organ of the United Nations, held its annual meeting. The World Health Assembly. As accepted, the meeting dealt with questions of mortality, life expectancy, spread of disease, and the need for vaccines. But the assembly also included one weird exception. It included a harsh condemnation of only one country. Once again, Israel. The resolution condemned what it termed the Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights. There was no explanation how this might be relevant to health issues. 200 meters from the Israeli Golan in Syria, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children are being massacred, and that wasn't mentioned even once. In fact, the only connection between the Israeli Golan and health issues is that for the past few years, Israel has quietly rescued hundreds of Syrian children who were injured in the fighting and treated them in our hospitals. The resolution also contained a series of false facts based on disgraceful Palestinian propaganda in a report presented to the World Health Organization. For example, the report argues that Israel injects Palestinians with viruses which cause cancer. This is a monstrous accusation, which wouldn't be out of place in Der Stürmer. And yet it was published without a shred of proof. The report was also decorated with photographs meant to enhance the drama. One which was captioned, "Taken during the Israeli War of Gaza 2014, is an image of a simulated attack on Tehran, which appeared on a popular blog a few years ago. The mountains surrounding the Iranian capital were removed using Photoshop to increase credibility." Another photograph is captioned, "The devastation caused by the Israeli war in Gaza of 2014. It was actually taken in Beirut in the early 2000s. All this in an official United Nations report, sponsored, distributed, quoted around the world. If you're still not convinced that something twisted and irrational is happening, you can visit the United Nations headquarters on the banks of the East River of New York. There you will find a permanent exhibition which deals with the Palestinian refugee problem. If you look carefully at the statistics in this exhibition, you will notice something really strange. In 1948, during Israel's War of Independence, around 700,000 Palestinians fled or were exiled. Each one is an individual tragedy, but it's worth remembering that Israel wasn't the aggressor in that war. The United Nations, the one and the same, voted for the creation of a Jewish state, and in response, the young state of Israel was attacked by 7 Arab armies and the local residents. During the fighting, many Palestinians left because they were told that Israel was on the verge of collapse, all the Jews would be massacred, and the Palestinians would get their homes and their cities. Thank God that it didn't happen. And the refugees had nowhere to return to. A tragedy for them, but one that happens in war. Actually, in this particular time in history, the 40s, it happened all around the globe on much bigger scales. This is where the bizarre process starts. Since 1948, not a single Palestinian has been expelled from Israel. No one disputes that, not even the Palestinians. In 1950, UNRWA, the United Nations organization in charge of helping the Palestinian refugees, was founded. At this time, it listed 750,000 Palestinians. That number is most likely inflated, but let's use this number for the sake of the discussion. The absurdity comes next. As of 2014, UNRWA lists no less than 5 million Palestinian refugees. In other words, without the expulsion of a single Palestinian, the UN has listed more than 4 million new Palestinian refugees. How did that happen? The answer is that the Palestinians are the only nation in the world, the only one, where the status of refugee can be passed down the generations. Today is the United Nations Refugee Day. According to a report published earlier this morning, 65.5 million people in the world were forced to leave their homes and their countries. 21 million of them are refugees, more than half of them children. But no one of them, not a single one, was born into the status of a refugee. Unless, of course, he is a Palestinian. The UN has changed the rules. Palestinians become refugees irrespective of whether they were born in a refugee camp in Lebanon, the Latin Quarter of Paris, or a villa in Qatar. My father was expelled from his home in Novi Sad, in Serbia, by the Nazis. He moved to Israel and built his home here. Does anyone in the world treat me or my children as Serbian refugees? Israel has over 1 million citizens who lived in the Arab world and were expelled or chased out of their homes just for being Jewish. Why does no one treat them as refugees, worthy of compensation? Why is it that only the Palestinians can be born in one country, but instantly receive refugee status from a country they've never been to? And if we're on the subject, what is the justification for the existence of UNRWA? Why did the UN create Why did the United Nations create a separate organization which deals only with the Palestinian refugees? Why do they have their own organization while all the other refugees in the world, from Darfur to Rwanda, to Syria to ISIS-controlled territories, do not? It's worth mentioning that UNRWA's work is mostly in the Palestinian territories, in Gaza and in the West Bank. And UNRWA employs Palestinian workers on relatively high Western salaries. As the number of refugees grows, so too does UNRWA. If they accept the reality that there are very few refugees left from those who fled in 1948, the organization would shrink and they would lose their place of work. To prevent that, they built a new and cynical industry. They manufacture refugees. The United Nations, instead of stopping them and managing the issue fairly and professionally, encouraged this distortion to continue. So what is actually happening? The answer is that the United Nations has become hostage to its own structure. Non-democratic countries have a huge majority in the General Assembly and in most of the committees. What used to be the non-aligned movement has grown to include 136 countries, many of which are Islamic states or depended upon oil money. These countries distorted the aims of the UN. They totally altered its way of functioning. They are partners with the BDS organizations whose aim is to delegitimize Israel, the Jewish state. Instead of an organization which protects freedom, democracy, liberal values, and world peace, parts of the UN has become the opposite. They have become collaborators with fundamentalist Islam and operatives for terror organizations like Hamas and like Hezbollah. The automatic majority of the non-democratic countries has become an automatic majority against Israel. Instead of serious debate about the problems of the world, the UN distributes disgraceful anti-Semitic propaganda. In this context, the relative silence of the United States and other democracies is distressing. The United States, our great friend and ally, funds 22% of the United Nations budget. In fact, 6 countries, the United States, Japan, France, Britain, Italy, and Germany, fund around 65% of the budget. All that is needed is for those countries to raise their voice and say loud and clear, they are unwilling to allow this to continue. This wild and fabricated attacks on Israel needs to be stopped. The UN cannot take American money, American resources, and American support and use them for a campaign that supports the destruction of the Jewish state. If the UN Human Rights Council wants democratic countries to continue to support it, it should act according to democratic values. It should be based first and foremost on the truth. Attacks on a democratic country committed to human rights in the service of murderous terror organizations is not in the United Nations mandate. There is no reason the United States and other democracies should agree to fund it. During my last visit to Washington, I discussed this with senators and members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans. They all agreed that the situation is intolerable. The American taxpayer should no longer consent to their money being used in this way. They don't work hard and pay taxes for that. On the other hand, when I discussed it with a senior American diplomat at the United Nations, he argued that it's better to change from within. That sounds reasonable enough, but we are too late. Those who hate Israel and hate democracy have beaten us to it. They've already changed the United Nations from within. The organization which preached justice and equality has been the subject of a hostile takeover. It's time for the democracies of the world to regain control of the United Nations. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Lapid.